Welcome to our deep dive, you guys, into the world of communication at work. We're going to be looking at how men and women communicate differently. Specifically, you send us some excerpts from Deborah Tannen's, talking from 9 to 5,
Yeah.
and, well, we're ready to help you decode those sometimes confusing workplace
Yeah.
conversations.
Tannen's book is such a classic, and I think for good reason. It really shines a light on how, conversational styles, which are often rooted in how we're socialized as kids, can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings at work, misinterpretations, all that.
Okay, so we're going to cover a lot today. Apologies, criticism, humor, indirectness.
Mm.
These are all things that we encounter every day at work.
Yeah.
But Tannen gives us a whole new way of seeing them.
Yeah. And what's so great about understanding these differences is that you can not only avoid awkward moments, but, you can learn to communicate more effectively no matter who you're talking to.
All right, so let's start with something that seems simple but can be a real minefield, and that's apologies. Those I'm sorry moments that can sometimes cause more harm than good. Tannen points out that for many women, I'm sorry isn't always a genuine apology.
Yeah, that's true. Women often use I'm sorry as a way to smooth over interactions or as a way to express empathy. And this can be really confusing for men who tend to interpret apologies as, an admission of fault.
So a woman might say, I'm sorry you're having a bad day, as a way of showing concern, but a man might hear that and think she's taking responsibility for his bad mood.
Exactly. And this difference in interpretation can have real consequences in the workplace. Think about performance reviews. If a woman constantly apologizes, even when she hasn't done anything wrong, it can make her seem less confident, less competent. It can impact her chances of getting a promotion or a raise.
That's such a good point. I mean, it's not about saying that women should never apologize, but rather about being aware of how that apology might be perceived and choosing your words carefully.
Right. And this also applies to the way we give and receive feedback. Tannen found that, men are more likely to give direct criticism, whereas women tend to soften it a bit. They're worried about, hurting someone's feelings.
It's interesting how that ties back to childhood, right? Like,
Mhm.
girls are often encouraged to be more nurturing, more considerate, whereas, like, boys are often taught to be competitive,
Mm.
more assertive. So, like, those patterns, they can carry over into how we communicate at work.
Absolutely. And it can lead to some, tricky situations. For example, imagine a woman who manages a team. If she is constantly cushioning her critiques, her team might not take her feedback seriously, or they might see her as lacking authority.
So what's the solution here? Should women just start giving blunt, direct criticism?
Well, not necessarily. It's more about finding a balance. Tannen suggests using phrases like, I'm wondering if, or have you considered, as a way to offer suggestions without sounding overly critical. It's about framing the feedback as a collaborative exploration rather than a judgment.
I like that. It's being honest and direct, but it's also being respectful and mindful of the other person's feelings.
Exactly. It's finding that sweet spot where your feedback is, it's clear, it's constructive, and it helps that person improve without, damaging their confidence or damaging the relationship.
This is really making me rethink how I give feedback. I've definitely been guilty of sugarcoating things in the past, thinking I was, being nice. But maybe I wasn't actually doing anyone any
Yeah,
favors.
it's a common mistake. We all want to be liked, right? And sometimes we shy away from those difficult conversations. But the truth is, giving and receiving constructive feedback, well, it's essential for growth, personally and professionally.
Okay, so we've talked about apologies, we've talked about feedback. Now let's move on to another area where men and women's communication styles often clash, and that's indirectness.
This is fascinating, I think, because Tannen, she challenges the assumption that indirectness is always a sign of weakness. In fact, she argues that people in positions of power often use indirectness to get things done, while maintaining that sense of politeness.
That's really interesting. So it's not just about being shy or hesitant. It can actually be strategic.
Exactly. For example, a boss might say, it's getting late, instead of just, directly telling their employee to finish up a task. Or they might say, we need to improve our efficiency, instead of singling out someone for being slow.
So the message is implied but not explicitly stated, and it's kind of up to the listener to interpret it correctly.
Right. And that's where things can get, a little bit tricky, especially if the listener isn't attuned to that communication style.
I can see how that would lead to some misunderstandings. Someone who's used to direct communication might miss those subtle cues and not realize they're being asked to do something.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of, your own communication style and how it might be perceived by others. If you tend to be indirect, make sure you're providing enough context, enough clarity so your message isn't lost in translation. And if you're dealing with someone who is indirect, try to, read between the lines. Pay attention to the subtext.
It's almost like learning a new language, right? You need to understand the nuances and those unspoken rules to communicate effectively.
I like that analogy. And just like any language, the more you practice, the more you, expose yourself to different styles, the more fluent you become.
Okay. So indirectness can be a powerful tool, but it's also important to use it wisely and to be mindful of, potential for misinterpretations. Now, I'm curious to hear more about how these different communication styles play out in other areas of work life.
Well, one area where we see these differences very clearly is, in how men and women use humor in the workplace.
Oh, yes, humor. Humor can be such a tricky thing to navigate at work. What one person finds funny, another might find offensive.
Exactly. And Tannen found that men and women often have very, different styles of humor, which can lead to misunderstandings, even conflict. Men are more likely to use humor that involves, teasing, sarcasm, even mock hostility.
I've definitely seen that. It's like they're trying to one-up each other with jokes,
Right.
and sometimes it can feel a bit aggressive.
Right. Especially for women who tend to prefer humor that's more self-deprecating or focused on, building connections and shared experiences.
So a woman might make a joke about herself to,
Yeah.
break the ice or to show she doesn't take herself too seriously, but a man might see that as a sign of weakness or insecurity.
It's a great example of how the same joke can land very differently depending on, the listener's gender and their communication style. And this can be especially problematic at work where humor is often used to, build rapport and establish those relationships.
So what's the takeaway here? Should we just avoid humor altogether at work?
Not necessarily. Humor can be a great way to, relieve stress, build camaraderie, even boost creativity. But it's important to, be mindful of your audience. And choose your humor wisely. Think about the message you're sending, the tone you're using, the potential impact on the people around you.
And maybe err on the side of caution, especially when you're not sure how your humor is going to be received. Better to be safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely. And remember, communication's all about context. Pay attention to the tone of voice, body language, and the overall relationship dynamic. Those cues can really help you decipher the true meaning behind the words. Avoid those misinterpretations.
This has been so insightful. It's like you're giving us this secret decoder ring for workplace communication.
Well, I like that analogy. Think of it as a way to become more fluent in that language of workplace interactions, understanding not just the words, but, those unspoken meanings behind them.
Okay. Now let's move beyond business tasks and look at how men and women use small talk at work.
This is another area where those different conversational styles can really come into play. Tannen argues that small talk isn't just idle chit-chat. It's a way to build rapport, establish connections, and even, gather some important information.
It's like that social glue that holds the workplace together. But it seems like men and women often have different approaches to small talk.
That's right. Men tend to use small talk to, to kind of establish their expertise and status within a group. They might talk about sports or politics or their accomplishments at work.
It's almost like they're trying to prove themselves or show that they're, in the know.
Yes, there's definitely an element of that. Women, on the other hand, tend to use small talk to build relationships and create a sense of, shared experience. They might talk about their families or their weekend plans or common interests.
It's more about finding that common ground and creating that sense of connection.
Exactly. And these different approaches can sometimes lead to, misunderstandings or even exclusion. For example, if a group of men are having a conversation about sports and a woman tries to join in, but, she doesn't share their knowledge or enthusiasm, she might feel left out or like she doesn't belong.
That's so true. It's like they're speaking a different language even though they're all using English words.
Exactly. And it's not just about the topics, but also about, the tone and style. Men tend to be more assertive and competitive in their small talk, whereas women tend to be more collaborative and empathetic.
It's like they're playing by different rules even though they're on the same team.
I love that analogy. And it's important to be aware of these differences so we can navigate those small talk moments more effectively and avoid those unintentional exclusions. It's about recognizing that there are many different ways to connect with people and that not everyone speaks the same quote unquote small talk language.
So if you're a woman who's trying to connect with a group of men, you might need to adjust your approach and find common ground that goes beyond, sports or politics.
Exactly. And if you're a man who's trying to connect with a group of women, you might need to dial back the assertiveness and focus on building a more collaborative and empathetic dynamic.
This is all so fascinating. It's like you're giving us this secret playbook for navigating the complex world of workplace communication.
I like that analogy. Think of it as, a guide to understanding the different players and their strategies. The more we understand about how people communicate, the better equipped we are to, achieve our goals and build those stronger relationships.
Okay. So we talked about apologies, criticism, indirectness, humor, and small talk. What other communication styles does Tannen explore?
Well, she also delves into this fascinating world of ritual opposition, which is a communication style that's more common among men.
Ritual opposition. What's that?
So it's a way of using language to kind of challenge ideas and engage in this playful debate, even when there's no real disagreement or conflict.
So like arguing for the sake of arguing.
In a way, yes, but it's not meant to be, aggressive or hostile. It's more like a verbal sparring match where the goal is to, sharpen each other's thinking, explore different perspectives. It's almost like a mental workout.
But doesn't that sometimes get out of hand?
Yeah.
What if people take it too seriously?
Well, it can, especially if someone's not familiar with that communication style. They might misinterpret it as a personal attack or a sign of disrespect.
I can see how that would be confusing. It's like they're speaking a different language.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these differences and to, adjust our expectations accordingly.
So if you find yourself in a conversation with someone who's engaging in ritual opposition, don't take it personally. See it as an opportunity to, challenge your own thinking, explore different viewpoints.
That's a great approach. And remember, communication is all about context. Pay attention to the tone of voice, the body language, the overall relationship dynamic. These cues can really help you decipher the true meaning behind the words and avoid those misinterpretations.
This is really making me rethink how I interpret conversations, especially at work. It's like there's this whole other layer of meaning that I've been missing.
And that's the beauty of exploring these concepts. It's about raising our awareness, expanding our communication toolkit. The more we understand about these subtle differences, the more effectively we can navigate the complex world of human interaction.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
Mm.
but I feel like there's still so much more to explore. What other fascinating nuggets of wisdom does Tannen offer in Talking from 9 to 5?
Well, she also delves into how men and women approach asking questions, which can be another area of miscommunication at work. Remember, everything we say at work is not just about, conveying information, but also about presenting ourselves in a certain way.
That's so true. It's like we're always performing, even when we don't realize it.
Exactly. And for many men, asking questions can be seen as a sign of weakness, especially, in those public settings.
Because it implies that they don't know something.
Precisely. It can threaten their sense of authority, their competence. This is why men might be more hesitant to, ask questions in meetings or during presentations.
But what about when they genuinely need information? Do they just suffer in silence?
Well, Tannen suggests that they might, seek out information in less public ways, like through one-on-one conversations or by doing their own research.
So they're still getting the information they need, but they're doing it in a way that kind of protects their ego.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between, seeking knowledge and maintaining a certain image.
This makes me think of that study Tannen mentions about how men are less likely to ask for directions when they're lost. Like they'd rather drive around in circles than admit they don't know where they're going.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how those societal expectations can influence our communication behaviors, even when those behaviors aren't necessarily in our best interests.
It's like those men would rather risk being late than risk appearing incompetent.
And that speaks to, that pressure that many men feel to project an image of confidence and self-reliance, even when they might be feeling unsure.
But doesn't that sometimes backfire? Like, What if they end up making a wrong decision because they were too afraid to ask for help?
It absolutely can. And that's why it's so important to create a workplace culture where asking questions is encouraged and it's seen as a sign of intelligence, not weakness.
It's about valuing curiosity and collaboration over ego and competition.
Exactly. And that's a shift that benefits everyone regardless of gender.
This deep dive is really highlighting like how much we can learn from each other's communication styles. It's not about judging or criticizing, but rather about understanding and adapting.
I couldn't agree more. It's about, becoming more fluent in that diverse language of human interaction so we can connect more effectively and create more, harmonious relationships.
Okay, so we've talked about apologies, criticism, indirectness, humor, small talk, ritual opposition, and even asking questions. What other communication styles does Tannen explore?
Well, she also delves into the ways in which men and women use language to negotiate, which can be another minefield of miscommunication.
Ooh, this is interesting. Tell me more.
Well, Tannen suggests that, men tend to approach negotiation as this like competitive game where the goal is to like win and come out on top.
While women are more likely to see negotiation as a collaborative process where the goal is to find a solution that works for everyone involved.
Precisely. And these different approaches can lead to some, clashes in communication style.
So a man might be more likely to like make demands and use like assertive language, while a woman might be more likely to ask questions and seek compromise.
Exactly. And while both approaches can be effective, they might be like misinterpreted by someone who's not familiar with that style.
It's like they're playing by different rules.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these differences and to, adjust our communication style accordingly.
So if you're negotiating with someone who has a more like competitive style, you might need to be more assertive yourself.
Exactly. It's about meeting them on their level while still staying true to your own, values and communication preferences.
This is all so fascinating. It's like you're giving us this secret playbook for navigating this complex world of workplace communication.
Well, I like that analogy. Think of it as like, a guide to understanding the different players and their strategies. The more we understand about how people communicate, the better equipped we are to, achieve our goals and build stronger relationships.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Apologies, criticism, praise, humor, asking questions, and negotiation. Uh, what other communication styles does Cannon explore?
Well, she also delves into how conversational styles can impact our perceptions of, competence and confidence, particularly for women. She argues that the way, women are often socialized to communicate can sometimes be misinterpreted as a lack of assertiveness or authority in the
Oh,
workplace.
that's so interesting. Can you give me some examples?
Yeah. Well, Tannen points out how, women often use language to kind of downplay their accomplishments or
Yeah.
to soften their opinions, which can inadvertently make them seem, less confident.
Like instead of saying, I did a great job on that project, they might say, I think it turned out okay.
Exactly. And while this might be intended as a way to be like humble or to avoid sounding, boastful, it can sometimes be perceived as a lack of self-assurance.
It's like they're undermining their own credibility.
Precisely. And this can have like real consequences in the workplace, especially when it comes to, performance evaluations, promotions,
Hmm.
salary negotiations.
So how can women communicate their accomplishments and expertise without sounding, arrogant or self-promoting?
It's about finding like that balance between humility and self-promotion. Tannen suggests using phrases like, I'm proud of the work I did on that project, or I'm confident that my skills and experience would be a valuable asset to your team.
It's about owning your accomplishments and stating your value clearly and confidently.
Exactly. And it's not about, bragging or being boastful, but rather about presenting yourself in a way that reflects your true worth.
This makes me think about how, women often apologize more than men, even when they've done nothing wrong.
That's a great point. Tannen calls this ritualistic apologizing, and she argues that it can be another way in which women inadvertently undermine their authority.
Like they're constantly seeking approval or validation.
Precisely. And while apologies can be appropriate in certain situations, overusing them can make you seem less confident, less competent.
So how can women break free from this pattern of like ritualistic apologizing?
Well, it's about, becoming more aware of our language and the messages we're sending. Instead of automatically saying, I'm sorry, take a moment to assess the situation and see if an apology is truly warranted.
And if it's not, don't be afraid to stand your ground and assert yourself.
Exactly. It's about communicating with, clarity and confidence while still being, respectful and considerate of others.
This deep dive is making me realize, how much our communication styles can impact our success at work.
It's true. Our communication, it's a powerful tool, and the more we understand about how to use it effectively, the more we can, achieve our goals and create a more fulfilling work experience.
Okay. We've talked about apologies, criticism, indirectness, humor, asking questions, negotiation, ritual opposition, and how conversational styles can impact perceptions of competence and confidence. What other communication styles does Tannen explore?
Well, she also explores the ways in which men and women use language to, to build rapport, establish connections, which can be another area where communication styles clash.
This is so interesting. Tell me more.
Tannen suggests that women tend to use language to, emphasize similarities, create a sense of shared experience, whereas men are more likely to use language to highlight their expertise, establish their status within a group.
So women might talk about their personal lives or share stories about common experiences, while men might talk about sports or politics or their accomplishments at work.
Exactly. And while both approaches can be effective ways to build rapport, they might be misinterpreted by someone who's not familiar with that style.
It's like speaking different dialects of relationship language.
I love that analogy. It highlights how important it is to be aware of these subtle differences in communication style and to adjust our expectations accordingly.
So if you're trying to connect with someone who has a more, task-oriented communication style, you might need to be more direct and focus on shared goals.
Exactly. It's about, meeting them on their level while still staying true to your own, values and communication preferences.
This makes me think about the whole concept of, small talk. Tannen argues that small talk isn't just idle chatter, but rather a way to build rapport, establish common ground.
That's a great point. And, she highlights how men and women often engage in different kinds of small talk.
So women might talk about, their families or their weekends, while men might talk about sports or current events.
Exactly. And while both approaches can be effective, they might not resonate with everyone.
It's like speaking different languages of connection.
I love that. It's a great way to think about it. And it's not just about, the topics we choose, but also about, the tone and style of our communication.
So women might use a more collaborative and empathetic tone, while men might use a more assertive and competitive tone.
Exactly. And these differences can sometimes lead to, misunderstandings, especially when people aren't aware of those, underlying communication patterns.
This deep dive is making me realize how much I need to pay attention to, the nuances of communication.
It's true. The more we understand about how people communicate, the better equipped we are to, navigate those complexities of human interaction and build, stronger, more fulfilling relationships.
Okay, so we've talked about apologies, criticism, indirectness, humor, small talk, ritual opposition, and even asking questions, negotiation, how conversational styles can impact perceptions of competence and confidence. What other communication styles does Tannen explore in talking from 9 to 5?
Well, she also explores how men and women use language to give praise and express appreciation, which can be another area where, misinterpretations arise.
It seems like something as simple as saying, thank you should be pretty straightforward, but you're saying there's more to it than meets the eye.
Exactly. Tannen observes that women tend to use praise and expressions of gratitude more frequently than men, and they often see it as a way to build rapport, strengthen relationships.
So for a woman, saying thank you might be a way of, acknowledging someone's contribution, showing that she values their work.
Yeah, and it also serves to create a sense of equality and mutual respect. Men, however, may not use these phrases as often, or they may, express appreciation in different ways.
They might show their appreciation through actions rather than words.
Precisely. A man might stay late to help a colleague finish a project, or go out of his way to offer support without, necessarily saying thank you explicitly.
So if a woman is expecting a verbal thank you and she doesn't receive it, she might misinterpret the man's actions and feel unappreciated.
That's a common scenario. And it highlights the importance of, understanding those different ways of expressing appreciation. If you're a woman, working with men, don't automatically assume they're ungrateful if they don't, shower you with thank yous. Pay attention to their actions and how they demonstrate their support.
And if you're a man, remember that your female colleagues might be expecting, more verbal affirmation. It doesn't hurt to say thank you more often. And it can go a long way in building, stronger working relationships.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, frequency, it's also about sincerity. Make sure your expressions of appreciation are, genuine and specific, highlighting, what you value about the other person's contribution.
So rather than just saying good job, you might say, I really appreciate how you handled that difficult client. You were calm, you were professional, and you resolved the issue quickly.
Exactly. That kind of like specific feedback is much more meaningful and impactful than just a like generic good job. It shows that you were paying attention and you genuinely value the other person's efforts.
Okay, so we've covered apologies, criticism, indirectness, humor, small talk, ritual opposition, asking questions, negotiation, perceptions of competence, how conversational styles can impact our perceptions of competence and confidence. Is there anything else Tannen covers that we can learn from?
Well, there's one more like important aspect of communication that Tannen explores that's, particularly relevant in today's workplace, and that's the use of technology and how it affects our interactions.
This is so relevant. I mean, we're constantly communicating through email, text, instant messaging, and video calls. Like, I have a whole new world of communication challenges.
It is, and Tannen points out that technology can, it can both enhance and hinder communication. On the one hand, it allows us to, connect with people, across geographical boundaries and time zones. On the other hand, it can create misunderstandings and distance if we're not careful.
I've definitely experienced that. It's so easy for a tone to get lost in an email or a text, and suddenly you're in a conflict that wouldn't have happened if you were talking face to face.
That's why it's so crucial to be, extra mindful of our communication when we're using technology. Choose your words carefully. Be aware of your tone and, use emojis or other cues to convey your intended meaning.
And maybe avoid having sensitive conversations or giving critical feedback via email or text. Those are better handled, in person or over a video call where you can actually see each other's facial expressions and body language.
I completely agree. It's also important to set clear boundaries around technology use, especially, in the workplace. Make sure you're not, constantly checking your phone or responding to emails during meetings. It shows respect for the people you're with and it allows you to be fully present in the conversation.
That's such a good point. It's so easy to get distracted by our devices, but it can really send the message that we're not really interested in what the other person has to say.
Exactly. And when it comes to building, strong relationships, both, personal and professional, there's no substitute for that face-to-face interaction.
This is really making me rethink my technology habits. I'm definitely guilty of being, glued to my phone sometimes, but I'm going to make a conscious effort to be more present and engaged in my interactions, especially at work.
I applaud that. It's a small change that can make a big difference in how you connect with people and how you're perceived in the workplace.
So in addition to all the other communication tips we've discussed today, we should also add, use technology wisely to the list.
Absolutely. Technology is a powerful tool, but it's important to use it in a way that enhances our communication rather than hinders it.
This deep dive into Tannen's Talking from 9 to 5 has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground. We've gained so many valuable tools for navigating this complex world of workplace communication.
It's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you. And remember, communication is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn and discover. But by continuing to expand our awareness, our empathy, our understanding, we can create a more harmonious and fulfilling work experience for ourselves and for those around us.
Wow, that was a deep dive into some really important concepts. We've talked about apologies, criticism, indirectness, humor, even small talk. But I feel like we've just scratched the surface of all the insights that Tannen offers in Talking from 9 to 5.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much more to unpack, and I think one of the things that really stands out to me is Tannen's emphasis on the fact that communication it's not just about the words we use, but also about the unspoken messages that we're sending.
The subtext,
Yeah.
the tone,
Yeah.
the body language, it all plays a role.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest challenges in workplace communication is that we often come to the table with very different communication styles, and those differences can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and misinterpretations.
So how can we become more aware of those differences and learn to communicate more effectively across those different styles?
Well, I think, the first step is simply to recognize that these differences exist, and that there's no one right way to communicate. It's not about, judging or criticizing other people's communication styles. It's about understanding and appreciating, the nuances of how people communicate.
It's like learning a new language, right?
Yeah.
You need to understand the grammar, the vocabulary, the cultural context in order to communicate effectively.
Exactly. And just like learning any new language, it takes practice and patience. We need to be willing to make mistakes, to ask for clarification, to be open to feedback.
And I think it's also important to remember that communication is a two-way street.
Right.
It's not just about sending our message, but also about receiving and understanding the other person's message.
Absolutely. Effective communication requires both speaking and listening skills
Yeah.
and a healthy dose of empathy and emotional intelligence.
So what specific steps can we take to actually improve our communication at work? Beyond just being aware of these different styles.
Well, here are a few tips. One is to pay attention to your tone of voice and your body language. Those nonverbal cues can convey as much information as your words, if not more. And be mindful of your audience and their communication style. What works for one person might not work for another. So you have to adjust your approach accordingly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions. If you're not sure what someone means, it's better to ask than to assume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about, seeking clarity rather than just jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. And practice active listening. When someone is speaking, really focus on what they're saying. Try to understand their perspective. Avoid interrupting or jumping in with your own thoughts.
Be present.
Exactly. And use I statements when you're expressing your own thoughts and feelings. That can help to avoid sounding accusatory or judgmental.
I like that, yeah. So instead of saying, you always do this or you never do that, you say, I feel this way when, or I'm concerned about.
Exactly. And be assertive but respectful. It's okay to stand your ground and express your opinions, but do so in a way that's respectful at others.
Right. It's about finding that balance between being strong and being kind.
Exactly. And be willing to compromise. Not every conversation is going to end with a perfect resolution. So be willing to compromise and find a solution that works for everyone involved.
These are all great tips. I'm definitely going to be putting them into practice.
I encourage you to, remember, communication is a skill that we can all improve upon. With practice and awareness, we can become more effective communicators and build stronger, more fulfilling relationships.
It's amazing. It feels like we've been given this decoder ring for all those little subtle signals that we see every day at work.
It is.
And like you said, it's not just about like avoiding those misunderstandings, but using these insights to actually connect and collaborate better.
Exactly.
Speaking of collaboration, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how understanding these communication differences
Yeah.
can actually make us, more effective leaders. How can understanding these like nuances in communication translate to better leadership?
Well, for one thing, it helps us to create a more inclusive and supportive work environment.
Okay.
When leaders are aware of these different communication styles, well, they can adapt their approach to make sure that everyone feels, valued, heard, and understood.
Because when people feel like their voices are heard, they're more likely to be, engaged and productive.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is especially important for women leaders who often, face these unique challenges in the workplace.
I was just thinking about that. There's this stereotype that women are less assertive leaders because they tend to use a more collaborative communication style. But Tannen, she challenges that notion, doesn't she?
She does, yeah.
Yeah.
Tannen argues that this perception is often based on, these outdated ideas about leadership, which equate assertiveness with, dominance and aggression.
So it's not about fitting into a certain mold of what a leader should be. It's about like finding your own authentic style.
Yeah.
That really resonates with your values and the needs of your team.
Exactly. And this means recognizing that there are many different ways to be an effective leader. A collaborative leadership style, which focuses on, building consensus and empowering others, can be just as effective, if not more so than a more, authoritarian style.
It's about inspiring and motivating people rather than just like giving orders.
Absolutely. And when leaders embrace a more, inclusive and collaborative approach, well, they create a work environment where everyone can thrive and contribute their best work.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about leadership.
Mm.
It's not about trying to be someone you're not, but rather about leveraging your own unique communication strengths to really build a strong and supportive team.
Well said. And it's a journey of self-discovery. It requires ongoing reflection, feedback, a willingness to challenge your assumptions.
So, as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, what final piece of advice would you give to our listeners who are, eager to apply these insights to their own lives, both at work and beyond?
Well, I would say embrace the diversity of communication styles. Don't be afraid to, ask questions, to clarify misunderstandings, to adapt your approach based on who you're interacting with. Remember, effective communication isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, being open, and being willing to learn from each other.
Beautifully said. This deep dive into talking from 9 to 5 has been a real eye-opener. It's given us the tools to navigate, those sometimes choppy waters of communication, especially in the workplace.
Mm.
And more importantly, it's given us like a new appreciation for the power of language and the impact it has on, our relationships and our success.
It's been a pleasure joining you on this deep dive. And, remember, the more we understand about how people communicate, the more effectively we can connect, collaborate, and create a more harmonious and fulfilling world, both at work and in every aspect of our lives.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise.
Mhm.
And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep those conversations flowing.